Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and young people. I'd like to thank the North Tyneside Holocaust Memorial Day Committee for inviting me to talk to you this morning. I feel as though I've always known that my father was a Holocaust survivor, but until the age of 55, I'd never heard his story because he never spoke about it. We were refugees from Hungary, and my parents came to England in 1956 with a suitcase full of clothes and 2 small children. My earliest memories are that although we had very little money, my mother always made sure that there was plenty of food on the table because she said that my father had been in a concentration camp and she never wanted him to go without food again. At the age of 6 or 7, I don't think I really understood what that meant, but over the intervening years, I must have absorbed information about the Holocaust from television and films and people talking about it. Don't forget, it was only about 20 or so years ago that the Holocaust had happened. As a child, I remember my father as a wonderful, kind, patient, and moral man whom everybody seemed to like. There was nothing to suggest the ordeal that he'd been through. Time passed, I grew up, got married, had 2 children, a boy and a girl. My son James became a journalist, and my daughter Deborah a doctor. It was the Jewish festival of Passover 10 years ago that I first heard my father's story. I'd just come back into the dining room from the kitchen. The whole family was relaxing round the dining table at the end of the evening. The lead up to this Passover had been particularly difficult because my dear mother-in-law Frida was dying of cancer, but she'd made it. As I put my head round the door, I heard my son James ask, "Were you in a concentration camp, Papa?" I held my breath, ready to jump in and change the subject if I felt my father didn't want to talk about his experiences. But something had changed. Maybe it was because it was his grandson asking the question, or maybe, seeing my mother-in-law, he realized that no one knows how long they will live. But suddenly, he felt able and willing to tell his story. And this is it. My father came from a religious family. His grandfather, Rabbi Shimon Kraus, was the rabbi of Arch, a small village in the northwest of Hungary, halfway between Budapest and Vienna. He was the eldest of 4 children and the only boy. He lived with his father Jenno, mother Sarah, and 3 younger sisters, Mady, Litza, and Eva. Hungary was invaded by Germany in 1944. It came late to the war. For the Jews of Germany, war had been coming since 1933. The Hungarian Jews had felt safe. Some Jews even fled to Hungary. My father, an able-bodied young man of 21, was sent to a forced labor camp called Bonhida Power Station in the oldest quarter of the city of Tatabánya. Forced labor was required of Jewish men during World War II because they weren't allowed to serve in the armed forces due to anti-Jewish laws. My father told us that conditions in Bonhida Power Station were not too bad, but a few months later he was transferred to Vertésöllő, another forced labor camp nearby, where he told us conditions were very much worse. The inmates lived in earthen bunkers and had to fell a quota of trees each day. The only food they received came from food parcels from home. Conditions got steadily worse until suddenly my father's food parcels stopped. What he didn't know then was that they'd stopped because the rest of his family had been taken to Auschwitz. At this point, news had filtered through to the camp that the Russian army was advancing to occupy the Hungarian capital of Budapest. And since they were allies, my father and 4 of his friends somehow managed to escape from Wertège-sur-Leu with a view of joining the Soviet front line. They fled to the mountains and wandered around looking for food and shelter. My father told a story that one day they came across a little hut in the middle of a vineyard where they discovered a couple of bottles of wine. And since they'd managed to dig up a few potatoes earlier in the day, they decided to cook the potatoes in the wine. What none of them realized was that wine boils at a very much lower temperature than water, so the potatoes would never cook. But because they were so hungry, they ate them anyway. Unfortunately for them, the Soviet advance had stopped, and they were picked up by a German army unit and taken back to their headquarters. Here, my father tried to persuade one of the officers that they'd been accidentally separated from their work unit. He said that when he looked into the German's eyes, he could tell that he didn't believe him. They were then taken back to Jew, a small town near Arch, and from there they were transported to Mauthausen, a Grade 3 concentration camp in Upper Austria. The Grade 3 camps were the toughest camps, and Mauthausen, unlike any of the other camps, was used for the extermination of the intelligentsia, those people who were highly educated. It formed the hub of a group of concentration camps in the area. It was surrounded by barbed wire fences and high stone walls, with guards observing constantly from watchtowers. My father told us that by the time he got there, the only people surviving in Mauthausen were living corpses. They had nothing to eat and were too weak to do anything. The bodies of the dead were burned in the gas chambers because at this point in the war, the Germans wanted to get rid of the evidence. Fortunately, my father only stayed in Mauthausen for a few weeks, and then he was transferred to Gunskirchen, one of the other concentration camps in the area. Gunskirchen was 10 miles away, and the starving inmates had to march the whole 10 miles. Anyone who fell or had to sit down was shot instantly. My father, like all the other inmates, was weak from starvation, and he told us that at one point he stumbled and almost fell, but his friend caught him and supported him until he could walk again, thereby saving his life. Gunskirchen was built to house only a few hundred inmates, but when it was ready, in April 1945, thousands of prisoners who were evacuated from Mauthausen on death marches were sent there. In these overcrowded conditions, diseases such as typhus and dysentery spread rapidly through the starving and weakened camp population. The inmates had a daily ration of a crust of bread and a bowl of watery soup. My father told us that approximately 200 people, men, women, and children, died each day, and it was his terrible job to help to bury the bodies. I just can't imagine how dreadful that must have been for a young man of 21. The Americans finally liberated the camp on May the 4th, 1945. My father, who was over 6 feet tall, weighed just 6 stones. My mother told us that he was so thin that the top of his thigh was thinner than his knee joint. My father said that he felt very little when he was freed. He was numb, and it didn't really register with him. He went to the surrounding houses and was given a little food. He considered himself one of the lucky ones. Those who were given more died because their stomachs couldn't handle the volume of food. He was then taken to a field hospital by the Allies, where he gradually recovered. And it was there that he learned that his grandfather, grandmother, Mother Sarah, and 2 little sisters, Eva and Litza, had all perished in Auschwitz, and only his father Jeno and Sister Mady had survived. 6 million Jews were murdered during World War II. To give you some idea how large that number is, if we held a minute's silence for each person who died, we would be silent for 11 years. Out of that 6 million, approximately 1/10, 500,000, were Hungarian Jews. The speed with which the Hungarian authorities cast out Jews from society, then robbed, segregated and deported them, was unprecedented in the history of the Holocaust. My beloved father died just over a year ago, leaving a huge gap in our lives. He was one of a diminishing number of Holocaust survivors who were able to give an eyewitness account of what had happened. There are people now who say it never happened, or that it wasn't as bad as people make out, or that they're fed up of the Jews going on about the Holocaust. Yes, it all happened a long time ago, more than several lifetimes for some of you. My beloved father was a Holocaust survivor, but after all he went through, he was still able to remain a kind, generous, and honest man who loved his fellow human beings. As his daughter, I could think, it was all such a long time ago. Why keep these awful memories alive? As I watch the television and read the newspapers, I see all around me man's inhumanity to man. After the atrocity of the Holocaust, you would think we would have learned a lesson, but we haven't. So it is up to people like you and me to remember and to remind the world what can happen if good people do nothing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marta. I think that must have been extremely difficult for you to tell that story.